Brian West never intended to draw attention to himself when he moved into the quiet coastal neighborhood of Cedar Grove, a place where hedges were always trimmed evenly, porch lights were set on timers, and mailboxes bore names older than most of the home's paint jobs. After 20 years in the tech and entertainment industries, Brian had made his share of contributions to the world of gaming, none of which he advertised to the neighbors who now waved at him from across the street while walking their dogs or dragging trash bins to the curb. Most of them thought he was some sort of retiree, maybe a systems analyst or a former consultant, based on his calm demeanor, firm eye contact, and the way he didn't rush to insert himself into neighborhood affairs. And Brian preferred it that way. He wasn't there to make a statement. He was there to finally breathe. When he bought the old Victorian-style house on Bay Ridge Lane, it was because it reminded him of something he couldn't quite define, a blend of nostalgia and stillness, with creaky floors, thick basement walls, and a cellar door that groaned like an old memory. The inspection had been long, thorough, and deeply satisfying. There was no mold, no wiring issues, no hidden repairs waiting to sabotage him. But what he did discover, once the final paperwork was signed and the movers had come and gone, was something far more unexpected than structural integrity. Beneath the house, past the basement laundry and a wall he assumed was part of a sealed crawlspace, he found a sealed door behind old sheetrock, a forgotten room. Or maybe, he thought with some awe, a preserved moment in time. Inside was what could only be described as an underground arcade, a space of about 500 square feet, with concrete flooring and a surprisingly well-maintained ventilation system. Lining the walls were 10 vintage arcade machines, ranging from Space Invaders and Galaga to less famous but equally historic cabinets like Major Havoc and Reactor. There was no dust, no graffiti, no wires chewed by rats. It was as if someone had locked it and walked away only yesterday. In the corner stood a wooden shelf with neatly organized records, blueprints for game cabinets, and old tax receipts dated from the early 1990s, all bearing the name Gerald Ashcroft. A quick online search revealed that Ashcroft had once run a Key regional arcade circuit throughout New England and had lived in the home until his death 6 years ago. He'd died without any immediate family, and the house had remained empty until the estate was finally dissolved and sold. Brian stood there in silence for several minutes, the blue light of the machines blinking idly into the darkness, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't stumbled into just any old home. He'd stepped into someone else's legacy, preserved not with intent to sell or display, but simply to remain untouched. It was a sanctuary, just like the kind Brian had once dreamed of when he first fell in love with arcade machines as a kid in the early 80s, back when he used to slip quarters into machines at the corner market, memorizing patterns, learning bugs and glitches, long before he ever knew he'd become part of the industry that now both thrilled and disappointed him. Unlike his peers who went on to host TED Talks, write books, and launch metaverse startups, Brian had kept his work focused and low-key. His studio was successful, wildly so in fact, but he preferred to stay out of the spotlight, letting his partner handle the press and public-facing side. What people never knew was that behind several of the most addictive and culturally pervasive mobile games of the last decade was a man who still thought in pixel grids and frame delay. This basement, untouched and humming with analog electricity, felt like an invitation. So Brian didn't tear it down. He didn't call a construction crew to convert it into a wine cellar or a home gym like any other new resident in Cedar Grove might have. Instead, he quietly restored it. The machines needed minimal work. A few power inverters were swapped, joystick gates were tightened, and one CRT screen was replaced with a custom replica to maintain its vintage resolution. Brian didn't upgrade them or alter the software. He made no flashy modifications. He respected what was there and brought it back to life with care, like a conservator restoring a painting, not a collector trying to show off. It took him 3 months to get everything back online, and during that time, he never said a word about it to anyone in the neighborhood. He wasn't hiding anything. He simply didn't feel the need to explain. Most nights after dinner, Brian would head down to the arcade with a cup of tea or a cold beer, power up 2 or 3 machines, and just play. Not for long, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. It wasn't about winning or beating high scores. It was about rhythm, about the sound of clicky buttons and the soothing loop of 8-bit music in a concrete room beneath a world that had moved on. Occasionally, he'd invite a visiting friend to come see it, but only close ones. People who understood what it meant to keep a thing alive not for profit, but for the sake of remembering what made you fall in love with it in the first place. Of course, even the most discreet setups aren't immune to the curiosity or suspicion of the wrong neighbor. In Cedar Grove, there was always someone with a clipboard or a community watch app ready to document the slightest disturbance. And in Brian's case, that person was Karen Jennings, a woman in her mid-60s who lived across the street and one house down. She had moved in 2 years before Brian, after her second husband passed away, and quickly became a self-appointed guardian of the community standard. Her front lawn bore a plaque commemorating a local garden award she'd won in 2019, and her porch had a hand-painted sign that read, "We don't dial 911. We call the mayor." Except she did, in fact, dial 911 regularly. The first time she noticed the glow of blue and green light emanating faintly from Brian's basement window, barely visible through the hedges. It was nearly midnight on a Saturday. She told herself she wasn't spying, only checking why the neighbor's house had a suspicious flicker. The next night, she saw it again. And again. On the 4th night, she marched outside in her robe, slippers crunching on the stone walkway, and stood on the sidewalk for a full 15 minutes, arms crossed, staring at the faint glimmer pulsing behind Brian's house. When she heard the faint electronic melody of a start screen and what she later described as coin slot sounds, she marched back inside and made the call. "911. What's your emergency? I think there's some kind of illegal gambling setup happening across the street. It's definitely an arcade and it's operating at night. Bright lights, weird noises. God knows who's down there. What kind of gambling? I don't know. But nobody builds an arcade in their basement for personal use. Not with that kind of noise. And he's always alone, which is even stranger. I'm telling you, it's suspicious. You need to send someone." The dispatcher, used to fielding everything from raccoons in attics to phantom trespassers, filed the report and sent a patrol car to check it out. The officer who arrived was polite, professional, and honestly a little bored. Brian welcomed him at the door, showed his ID, and calmly explained that there was no gambling, no business, no minors involved. He even brought the officer downstairs and let him inspect the machines. Within minutes, it was clear. This wasn't a casino. It wasn't even a social gathering spot. It was just a man with a passion for preservation. Oh, the officer left, satisfied. Case closed. Except for Karen, it wasn't. For Karen Jennings, the police response, or lack thereof, was not only insufficient, it was infuriating. Watching the patrol car reverse calmly out of Brian West's driveway without so much as flashing its lights, she stood by her window, clutching a cup of decaf tea, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. She had watched the officer walk in, seen him descend the steps to the basement alongside the suspect, and then re-emerge smiling and nodding, as if they'd just bonded over sports or shared memories. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew a brush-off when she saw one. That night, she wrote the first of what would become several long, meticulously formatted complaint letters, not only to the local precinct but to the zoning office, the property oversight committee, and the municipal complaint line. She kept a log. She time-stamped her emails. She even attached screenshots from her phone showing blurry images of the faint arcade lights, which she labeled suspicious illumination, consistent with unauthorized commercial use. Brian, meanwhile, continued his quiet routine, unaware at first that the matter hadn't ended with the police visit. He took comfort in the officer's response, interpreting it as proof that reasonable people could still recognize when something was simply harmless nostalgia. But Karen was not interested in reason. She wasn't satisfied with the lack of escalation, and over the following days, she made it her personal mission to expose what's really going on at 314 Bay Ridge. Her theory evolved. At first, it was simply a matter of zoning. Why would someone install dozens of power-consuming machines in their basement unless they intended to make money? Then, as her speculation grew unchecked, it became something more sensational. A secret crypto-mining operation, perhaps. Or a front for illegal betting on underground gaming tournaments. She'd heard about these things on YouTube, read stories online. It was never just old games and innocent fun. There was always a darker purpose. She began telling neighbors what she knew. Not suspected, knew. Words like unlicensed equipment, commercial-grade cabling, and soundproofing began appearing in her conversations with other residents. One afternoon, while Brian was hauling a new air filter to the basement, he noticed something odd. His mail had been opened and resealed. The tape was poorly aligned, and the envelope flap was creased in a way that suggested tampering. At first, he thought it might have been a rough delivery, until he received another envelope a few days later, this one missing a document he distinctly remembered printing. He checked his mailbox the following day and found it slightly ajar, even though he always closed it securely. It was subtle, but it was enough to make him pause. He didn't leap to accusations. Instead, he installed a discreet camera on the corner of his porch, just angled enough to catch anyone approaching the box. Within a week, he had footage of Karen standing in front of his house with her phone raised, snapping photos of his driveway and peering over the hedge. That same night, the footage caught her leaning toward his mailbox, not opening it, but clearly testing whether it was locked. Rather than confront her directly, Brian took the footage to his lawyer. The man, a property attorney named Len Abrams, had handled Brian's purchase of the home and respected the fact that his client preferred discretion over drama. After reviewing the footage, Len made 2 suggestions. Install a lockable mailbox and document everything, every unusual occurrence, every interaction. He also offered to draft a formal cease and desist letter should the behavior continue. Brian agreed to the first 2, but opted to hold off on the letter. "No need to escalate," he said. "Let's just keep eyes on it." But escalation was coming, regardless of his intentions. A week later, Brian received a formal notice from the city's Department of Planning and Zoning. The letter, written in dry, bureaucratic language, informed him that a complaint had been filed regarding potential unauthorized commercial activity on the premises, and that an inspection might be scheduled if deemed necessary. Brian's heart sank, not from fear, but from the sheer irritation of knowing exactly where the complaint had come from. He contacted Len, who immediately filed a written response refuting the claim and attached all the relevant documentation: property use verification, electric permits, residential classification certifications, and proof that the machines in the basement were neither connected to nor used for commercial purposes. 2 days later, Brian noticed a man with a city badge standing at the edge of his property, clipboard in hand. He didn't approach the house, didn't ring the bell, just stared for a few minutes, wrote something down, and left. Brian had seen enough passive-aggressive tactics in corporate boardrooms to recognize this one. The city wasn't ready to push forward, but it had begun taking notes. That same evening, a typed letter appeared on his front door, unsigned but clearly written by Karen. It warned of the moral and legal consequences of hosting commercial activity in a residential zone, and ended with a bolded statement. The community is watching. Brian didn't flinch. He called Len again. This time they agreed to send the cease and desist, not as a threat, but as a boundary. It was delivered by certified mail 2 days later. Karen never acknowledged it, but for a short while the tension seemed to recede. No more photos, no more mailbox meddling. The arcade remained off-limits to anyone but Brian, and the lights only glowed on weekends now, just in case. He wasn't scared, but he was starting to feel the first signs of fatigue, the psychological grind of being under a neighbor's lens. Then came the night of the mistaken delivery. A delivery driver, new to the neighborhood, accidentally left a large electronics box on Karen's porch instead of Brian's. It had been clearly addressed to Brian, with his name and full number. Karen opened it. No one saw her do it. But when Brian contacted the delivery service to track the package, they confirmed it had been marked "delivered" at the correct location. He walked over the next afternoon, rang her doorbell, and calmly asked if any deliveries had come for him. Karen smiled tightly, said no, and closed the door. 48 hours later, the box appeared by his garage, opened, resealed, and missing the service manual. It had contained a vintage replacement monitor for one of the older machines. Expensive, custom-ordered, and impossible to find locally. That missing manual had Brian's name printed inside the binding. He found it days later in the gutter between their two houses, water-damaged but legible. That moment changed things. Brian wasn't dealing with passive interference anymore. He was dealing with someone willing to cross illegal lines under the veil of community concern. He scanned the document, filed a report with Len, and this time asked him to send a copy of the previous cease and desist directly to the district mediation board with a new attachment detailing the stolen mail incident. "This is harassment," Len said flatly. Brian nodded. "And I'm done pretending it's not." Still, the official route took time. Forms, documentation, hearings, it all moved slower than Karen's escalating behavior. One morning, Brian woke to find that someone had placed a laminated flyer on every house in the block, including his. It featured a grainy, low-resolution photo of his basement window glowing blue and a bold headline reading, "Who is really living at 314 Bay Ridge?" The flyer accused him of running an unregistered business, cited fictional legal clauses, and urged neighbors to protect the integrity of the neighborhood. It was signed, simply, "A concerned resident." The last line read, "If the city won't act, the neighborhood must." Brian stood at his kitchen table holding the flyer in both hands, his jaw tight, the fluorescent morning light reflecting off the laminate. He didn't speak. He simply folded it in half, placed it into an envelope marked for his lawyer, and walked downstairs to the arcade, the only place in the house where he could hear his own thoughts over the static of neighborhood hysteria. This wasn't going away, and he was done waiting for it to blow over. Brian had always believed that the best way to deal with conflict was to approach it with patience, precision, and clarity. It was a principle that had served him well throughout his professional life. Calm over confrontation, data over assumption. But in the weeks following the neighborhood flyer incident, that belief was tested more than he anticipated. The flyer, now confirmed by his attorney to be grounds for a defamation complaint, had begun to subtly shift the mood around Bay Ridge Lane. Conversations that once felt friendly now turned brief. Neighbors who once waved without fail now hesitated, sometimes looking away or offering only curt nods. A local couple, the Levines, who had previously invited him to their garden parties and always asked about his renovation progress, began crossing the street when walking their dog if they saw him out front. Brian wasn't naive. He didn't expect everyone to be brave in the face of gossip, especially when the gossip was printed and distributed in laminate. But what disturbed him wasn't just the change in behavior. It was the rapid spread of distrust. The way an unfounded story, presented with just enough pseudo-legal dressing, could start to look like truth to those who only read headlines. He doubled down on documentation. Every incident, every abnormal interaction, every anonymous note or unexplained item left near his property, he logged them all. A new folder, both digital and physical, was created solely for the growing paper trail. His lawyer, Len, escalated the matter to a municipal mediator and filed a preliminary motion seeking a formal cease of neighborhood defamation under community standards. But the process was slow, and while the legal mechanisms began to turn, Karen's campaign against him evolved. She stopped addressing him directly and instead used intermediaries. At a local town meeting, one of the casual monthly sessions hosted by the Parks and Neighborhoods Council, a resident brought up concerns about basement noise pollution and long-term infrastructure stress from specialized machinery. The phrasing was vague, the sources unnamed, but it was clear to everyone at the table who they were referencing. Brian was there, sitting quietly near the back, wearing a charcoal sweater and listening without flinching. He didn't stand to respond. Instead, he followed the speaker to the parking lot afterward, calmly introduced himself, and asked what specific noise complaints they had heard. The man blinked, clearly caught off guard, and muttered something about a neighbor saying there were vibrations and just wanting to make sure everything was safe. Brian thanked him and walked away without further challenge. He had no interest in winning an argument on a sidewalk. He needed facts, not friction. The next day, he scheduled an inspection, not because anything was wrong, but because he wanted to get ahead of whatever rumors Karen was planning to push next. He called a licensed structural engineer and a certified electrician, and within a week, both professionals had walked the property, assessed the arcade basement, and issued clean reports. The sound levels from the machines, even at full volume, didn't register beyond his property line. The power consumption was well within residential thresholds. There were no violations, no overlooked faults. He asked both professionals to sign notarized statements, which he added to his growing file. Len reviewed them and smiled. If this goes to a hearing, we're walking in with armor. But even armor doesn't stop petty tactics. Brian came home one Thursday afternoon to find that the small utility gate along the side of his yard had been unlatched. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, but the latch, which he always locked, was hanging open. The grass nearby had been trampled, and a shallow footprint in the mud led toward his backyard fence, then disappeared. It wasn't a strong enough violation to report, but it was a message. Karen, or someone acting on her behalf, wanted him to know he was being watched, and that fences didn't matter. That same week, he noticed odd behavior from the neighborhood maintenance crew. A pair of contracted landscapers spent an unusual amount of time near his front hedges, pretending to trim an area that hadn't grown in weeks. One held a phone at waist level, pointed vaguely in the direction of his home. When Brian stepped outside to water his plants, the man quickly turned away. Brian didn't accuse. He simply stepped inside, copied the video footage from his porch camera, and saved it to the archive. Then came the garbage incident. Early one morning, as Brian stepped outside to retrieve his recycling bin, he found the contents scattered across his driveway. Cans flattened, glass shards from broken bottles embedded in the gravel, and a sticky trail of soda seeping toward the curb. It wasn't the usual neighborhood nuisance. This was targeted. He checked the camera footage and saw a shadowy figure, hard to identify in the poor lighting, tipping the bin over shortly after midnight and kicking it violently before walking away. He enhanced the video, tried to isolate the gate, the build, but it was too dark. Still, he added the footage to the growing report and sent a copy to Len. "We've got a pattern," Len replied. "And patterns are what judges pay attention to." By now, Brian was no longer just trying to protect a personal passion project. He was defending his right to live without manufactured suspicion, without being stalked by an emboldened neighbor who had turned paranoia into performance. The arcade was no longer just a room with games. It had become symbolic of boundaries, of control, of how easily fear could twist facts into threats. And Karen wasn't stopping. She shifted tactics again. This time, she filed a complaint with the city's Residential Development Board, alleging improper retrofitting and potential code violations related to electrical noise, residential capacity use, and subfloor structural risks. Her wording was clever. She never claimed Brian was running a business. She framed it as concern over the long-term safety of non-standard equipment installed in non-commercial space. The city, following protocol, scheduled a follow-up inquiry. Not a raid, not an enforcement action, but a home visit by a compliance officer. Brian prepared thoroughly. He printed every inspection, every receipt, every licensed approval. When the officer arrived, a woman named Clarissa Wilborn, polite but clearly methodical, he gave her a guided tour, answered every question, showed her the layout of the machines, and explained the modifications. Clarissa nodded frequently, took notes, and at the end of the visit said calmly, "I'm not seeing any violations here. I'll file the report accordingly." Brian thanked her, walked her to the door, and watched from the window as she stopped by Karen's house on the way to her car. They spoke briefly. Karen gestured toward Brian's property, animated and defensive. Clarissa listened, nodded once, then got in her vehicle and left without a word. But the next day, someone had nailed a sign to the telephone pole in front of his home. It wasn't official, just a piece of laminated poster board with black block letters that read, "Keep our neighborhood safe. Say no to basement industry." It was unsigned. The words "basement industry" were underlined in red. Brian stared at it for a long time before removing it. He didn't tear it down. He took it off carefully, placed it in a file folder, and added it to the archive. Then, for the first time in months, he left the arcade powered off that evening. Not out of fear, but out of restraint. If this was war, he would fight it on his terms, and that meant staying one step ahead, even in silence. There was something eerily quiet about the way the storm finally crested. It didn't arrive with police sirens or property seizures or even the media circus Brian had begun to suspect Karen was chasing. Instead, it came wrapped in civility and protocol, dressed in the cool tones of municipal formalities and neighborhood politics. It began with a letter, neatly folded, stamped with a blue ink signature, and delivered not through regular mail but by hand, via a city liaison. The document informed Brian that a formal mediation session had been scheduled regarding persistent community concerns surrounding the non-standard use of residential property. It wasn't accusatory in tone, nor was it legally binding, yet. It was the city's way of avoiding litigation, offering both parties a forum for resolution. It also meant, plainly, that Karen had succeeded in bringing her complaints beyond the neighborhood and into the city's conflict resolution system. Brian knew better than to dismiss it. This was the pivot point, the moment where rumor became inquiry and inquiry could become judgment, not in court, but in the murky territory of city oversight and community boards where rules were flexible and language even more so. He didn't prepare alone. Len, always pragmatic and never theatrical, hired a specialist to help him craft the presentation, an urban use and zoning consultant with experience in defending unorthodox home projects. They compiled a full portfolio, stamped inspection documents, legal zoning certifications, and photographs demonstrating the non-commercial nature of the space. Brian even included detailed logs of his arcade usage, clearly showing it operated only during personal hours and never involved third parties or public access. It was comprehensive, objective, and backed by city-approved data. Karen, on the other hand, brought two things. A folder filled with printed photographs, mostly of Brian's house at night, lights glowing faintly through the window, and a handwritten petition with signatures from 7 residents who had agreed to support a review of unmonitored activities. No one on the list claimed harm. Most cited discomfort, uncertainty, or a shift in neighborhood character. The mediation took place in a nondescript room at the city's municipal building, neutral and beige in every possible way. A circular table sat in the center. Brian, Len, and the zoning consultant took their seats on one side. Karen, flanked by a lean attorney whose expression suggested he had been hired more for presence than purpose, sat across from them, her hair pinned tightly, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She didn't smile. She barely acknowledged Brian. The mediator, a woman named Monica Hill with the firm voice of someone who had resolved far worse disputes than suburban paranoia, began by reading the purpose of the session. Then, one by one, each side presented their position. Len spoke first. His voice was clear, even, and methodical, walking through each of the documents they'd provided, highlighting the legal protections Brian had as a homeowner and emphasizing that all claims of disturbance had already been reviewed and dismissed through proper inspections. Then came the zoning consultant, who elaborated on the unique history of basement retrofitting in older neighborhoods, making it abundantly clear that Brian's setup not only met safety codes but exceeded many in terms of electrical containment and acoustic insulation. Finally, Brian himself was asked to speak. He did so calmly, outlining his intentions with the arcade, its private nature, and his desire to preserve a piece of history without disturbing anyone around him. "I moved here for peace," he said, "not secrecy. I've built something personal, quiet, and harmless. What I'm defending is not a project, but my right to keep it." Karen's attorney followed. His remarks were short, vague, and largely ceremonial. Statements about community concern and perceived disruption, none of which were backed by code violations or legal precedent. Then Karen spoke. Her voice, surprisingly steady, carried the weight of controlled emotion. "I don't want to ruin anyone's life," she said, "but I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I've seen what happens when boundaries erode. First, it's lights, then it's noise, then it's visitors. Then suddenly the whole block changes, and no one knows who their neighbor is anymore. I'm asking for transparency, for oversight. If what he's doing is harmless, then why does it feel so concealed?" Brian didn't respond. Monica asked both sides if they'd be willing to enter a voluntary agreement of operational transparency, Karen's term for biannual inspections and noise monitoring. Len declined on Brian's behalf. "Our client is in full compliance. There is no legal basis for conditional surveillance of private use." Monica nodded, and after 2 hours of polite warfare, the session ended with no resolution. The mediator's final report would go on file, but without legal traction, it amounted to a footnote. Still, as Brian left the room, he sensed a shift. Not a defeat, not a win, but a marker. He was no longer just a target of suspicion. He was a known entity now, officially reviewed and recorded. Karen, for her part, looked unsatisfied. Her lawyer had barely spoken during the session, and as they left, she refused to make eye contact with Brian, stepping quickly into the hallway as if retreating from a battlefield. It should have felt like closure, But to Brian, it felt more like the end of Act 1, the part where the shadows stop moving in the background and step into view, bolder and hungrier. The next morning, he found a dead crow on his front steps. No note, no symbols, just the bird, twisted unnaturally, its wings half open and eyes dull. Whether it was coincidence, a message, or just another grim gift from nature, Brian took no chances. He reported it to local animal control, who removed it without much interest, and he filed a brief incident update with Len, who simply replied, "Documented. Stay alert." The arcade remained silent that week. Brian didn't switch it on once, not because he feared confrontation, but because he knew how escalation worked. It didn't come loud. It came slowly, through routine violations and legal attrition. He had survived the first siege. Now he had to prepare for the long war. By the end of the following month, Brian began to understand that escalation doesn't always follow the path of aggression. Sometimes it's more insidious, wrapped in the language of administrative procedure and community well-being, where every motion feels like a subtle tightening of a noose designed to look like a neighborhood initiative. What began as one neighbor's personal vendetta was now morphing into something wider, more organized, and far more dangerous, not because it gained validity, but because it gained traction. Karen, undeterred by the unresolved mediation, changed her approach entirely. No longer satisfied with direct confrontation or city complaints, she began constructing what Brian later referred to as the architecture of public legitimacy. It started innocently enough, a flyer on a new neighborhood bulletin board inviting residents to the Bay Ridge Neighborhood Integrity Meeting, hosted not at City Hall but in the living room of a retired school administrator named Claudia, a longtime resident with sway among the older families. There was no mention of Brian on the flyer, no reference to the arcade, but the phrase "unregulated activity" was bolded, and the invitation promised to address issues of modernization, transparency, and residential peace. Brian was notified of the meeting by a younger neighbor, Jeremy, who texted him a photo of the flyer with the message, "This looks aimed at you. Want me to go?" Brian thanked him, declined, and instead asked for any updates afterward. Jeremy attended, took notes, and confirmed what Brian feared. The meeting was thinly disguised theater. Karen presented a slideshow with selective photos, images of his house at night, energy diagrams taken from public utility estimations, and a list of noise complaints she claimed had been anonymously submitted, but had never shown up in any formal report. She framed the presentation around the idea of prevention, suggesting that inaction today could result in an irreversible shift in neighborhood tone. Several older residents nodded in agreement, though not all. Jeremy said at least 3 people seemed visibly uncomfortable, especially when Karen brought up Brian's lack of community integration and framed it as withholding. It wasn't illegal, she said, but it created a barrier of trust. When pressed by a woman in the back about actual violations or proven risks, Karen deflected, saying, "This isn't about punishment, it's about accountability." Brian's hands clenched as he read Jeremy's notes, not in anger but in exhaustion. He knew what this was now, a campaign not of legal power but of social erosion. The kind where pressure is applied not by authorities but by those who think they're acting in defense of order. He responded in the only way he knew how: preparation. The next morning, he contacted a private compliance advisor, someone who specialized in reputation containment and conflict protocol for individuals in semi-public roles. He didn't disclose his career, but he mentioned his legal visibility and desire to prevent defamation from spiraling into brand risk. The advisor, a blunt man named Rains, visited his home a few days later, walked the perimeter, assessed the basement, and gave him this. They're not trying to shut you down. They're trying to box you in. Their goal isn't to win legally. It's to make your life more difficult than the arcade is worth. They'll stretch you until you either move or make a mistake they can capitalize on. My job is to make sure that never happens. Brian hired him on the spot. Within 2 weeks, Raines initiated a silent but firm presence in the neighborhood. He walked the area once a day, spoke with no one, and reported only to Brian. Cameras were upgraded. Nothing ostentatious, just smarter placement and discreet server backups. He also suggested Brian temporarily stop using the arcade, not as a surrender, but as a recalibration. If they think the machine's off, they might get lazy. That's when they slip. Brian agreed. The arcade lights stayed off for nearly 2 weeks. During that time, Karen's movement gained another layer, a formal neighborhood committee named Residential Culture and Standards Coalition, a name so bland it almost escaped attention. It wasn't recognized by the city, but it had a mailing list, a rotating meeting schedule, and volunteers who dropped off newsletters that discussed things like property harmony, routine safety evaluations, and electromagnetic interference, a veiled reference, Brian suspected, to the old lie about arcade systems disrupting local signals. And then came the tipping point. One evening, as Brian returned from a late grocery run, he found 2 men standing at the edge of his property line. They weren't taking photos. They weren't trespassing. They were simply standing there, as if measuring something in the air between them. Brian parked, exited his car, and approached. "Evening," he said. One of the men nodded, but didn't respond. The other simply said, "We're part of the survey crew. There's been a request to assess property elevation for drainage planning." It was a lie. Brian asked to see documentation. They claimed to have submitted credentials to the city. When he called municipal services the next morning, they had no such record. Raines pulled security footage and isolated both faces. They matched no local contractors. This was no longer neighborly pressure. This was harassment under the pretense of civil inquiry. Len filed an immediate complaint with the city, citing trespassing and impersonation of municipal personnel. The footage was submitted as evidence. That same week, Brian received a cease and desist from the Residential Culture and Standards Coalition. It demanded he submit to a voluntary but strongly advised site assessment by their advisory panel, including one self-proclaimed electrical expert and 2 committee members who had no legal authority. The letter cited ongoing community distress and referenced the mediation session as proof of his prior conflict history. It was, as Len dryly stated, the closest thing to a neighborhood shakedown I've seen that didn't involve a pitchfork. Brian didn't respond. Instead, he filed a restraining order against further committee access to his property and formally refused all inspection requests from non-authorized personnel. He posted a letter on his front door stating all legal visits required prior notification and credentials. Raines circulated it quietly to key community members, some of whom seemed surprised, if not disturbed, by how far things had gone. A few days later, one of the original petition signers knocked on Brian's door. He introduced himself as Walter, apologized for getting swept up, and admitted that Karen had told him Brian was hiding some kind of illegal server bank. Brian said nothing. He simply nodded and closed the door gently. But Karen wasn't finished. The coalition, now emboldened by visibility and faux authority, pushed for a neighborhood vote to adopt a list of community expectations, non-binding but published publicly. Among the proposals were clauses about non-traditional energy usage, visible technological disturbances, and discouragement of any activity that alters the perceived character of shared residential space. The phrasing was vague on purpose. It was designed to sound inclusive while being weaponizable. Brian attended the meeting where the vote was held, sat silently in the back, and watched as 10 residents voted in favor, 4 against, and 6 abstained. The expectations passed. Karen stood at the front of the room, hands clasped, smiling faintly like a parish leader concluding a sermon. As people left, Brian caught snippets, some confused, some indifferent, a few even defensive about having supported the measure. No one seemed to know what the rules meant, but they were printed, circulated, and referenced as if they were law. That night, Brian sat in the arcade with the lights off, listening to the quiet hum of dormant machines. Raines entered without knocking, nodded once, and sat across from him. "They're playing the long game," he said. "We counter with facts, documentation, and silence. No speeches, no press. Just attrition in the opposite direction." Brian asked what that looked like. Raines replied, "We hit them where they rely on assumption. You've already won legally. Now we make it too embarrassing for them to keep pretending you haven't." And with that, Brian approved the next phase, submitting a public clarification document to the city council detailing his rights, the misuse of community pressure, and a request for protective oversight against unlicensed community enforcement. The document was dry, clinical, but powerful. It sparked internal city conversation. Karen didn't know it yet, but the tide was turning. Her coalition had stepped out of line. Now it was being watched not by neighbors, but by officials with the power to make real decisions. Brian hadn't won. Not yet, but he had shifted the terrain. And the next move was his. The final surge didn't come from a confrontation, a police raid, or a sudden act of violence. It came from a miscalculation. Karen Jennings, who had spent the better part of the year constructing a web of insinuation, pressure, and petty bureaucracy, made the classic error of assuming her reach exceeded her grasp. The growing coalition she had cultivated under the pretense of community protection had reached its peak, bloated with pamphlets, advisory letters, and an exhausting stream of neighborhood rhetoric. For all her performative moderation, there remained in her something brittle and impulsive, something that refused to allow ambiguity to exist without containment. So when her group received word that the city council would not be recognizing their charter as an official regulatory body, citing procedural inconsistencies and a lack of legal grounding, Karen responded not with caution, but with escalation. She drafted an open letter to the city, accusing certain members of the council of indifference toward community risk, and appended a list of concerns that were, in truth, loosely disguised allegations about Brian's property. Her tone was more forceful than usual, less tempered by legal advice, and the letter was posted not only online, but physically pinned to doors, local cafes, and community boards. Brian's full name was used. So was his address. And for the first time, her accusations turned personal. She accused him of exploiting zoning loopholes, of bringing outside contractors into the neighborhood without background checks, of creating a hub of potential digital trafficking under the guise of nostalgia. It was absurd. It was defamatory. And it was the final nail in her credibility. Brian read the letter in silence. Raines had brought him a printed copy retrieved before Karen's group could begin its usual cycle of vague denials and selective edits. Len was looped in within the hour. They agreed unanimously. It was time to take the gloves off. No more waiting, no more countering, no more damage control. A full defamation suit would be filed within 48 hours, naming Karen as the primary defendant and listing the coalition as a secondary entity. The charges would include libel, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and unlawful use of personal information for community-wide distribution. Brian had the documentation. He had the inspection records, the zoning confirmations, the verified legal approvals, the correspondence history, and enough eyewitness accounts to make the case unassailable. And, more importantly, he had the will, not out of vengeance, but necessity. There was no peace to be found in accommodation. Only through exposure and legal resolution could the campaign against him end. The suit was filed on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, Karen had received a formal notification and a courtesy call from a city liaison advising her to cease all public communication about Brian until the matter was settled. The next day, the flyer campaign abruptly stopped. The bulletin boards were cleared. The coalition website was taken offline. And for the first time in months, Brian's house stood unobserved. No hedge peeking, no clipboard sightings. The quiet was almost uncomfortable in its suddenness. But it wasn't over. Legal processes move slowly, and public sentiment, even when chastened, tends to linger. So when Karen attempted to hold an emergency community meeting at the same retired administrator's house to clarify her position, she was stunned to discover that only 3 people arrived. One was her cousin. The other 2 left within 15 minutes, citing discomfort with the direction things had taken. News of the lawsuit had spread. Quietly, of course, but enough for people to understand that the tide had turned, and they didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of it. Karen's attorney, who had once been content to sit in meetings without speaking, now became visibly concerned. He contacted Len privately, requesting a possible resolution discussion to avoid escalation. Len refused. They weren't interested in private handshakes anymore. Brian wanted everything on record. And so, the city prepared for an open preliminary hearing, a procedural formality, but one that would bring Karen's campaign into full public view. It wasn't a trial, not yet, but it would be the first time the issue would be placed under the lens of municipal transparency, where testimony, evidence, and public accountability would replace gossip and passive suggestion. The announcement of the hearing was public, and within days the local atmosphere shifted again, not with hostility, but with an almost uncomfortable curiosity. The same residents who had once eyed Brian's house with suspicion now slowed their cars as they passed, perhaps wondering if they had been too quick to believe what was easiest to fear. On the day of the hearing, Brian wore a gray suit, no tie, and sat in silence as Len laid out the case. They did not dramatize. They did not accuse needlessly. They simply listed the facts: the surveillance, the trespassing, the flyers, the slander, the manipulation of city processes. Karen's lawyer attempted to downplay her actions as misguided concern, but he lacked both evidence and credibility. When Karen was asked to speak, she began with poise, but by the end of her remarks, her voice was brittle, defensive, and increasingly erratic. She talked of community erosion, of values, of digital addiction, and hidden corruption. None of it was supported. Much of it wasn't even coherent. The council members exchanged glances. The hearing was adjourned with a formal note. The defamation suit would proceed. City oversight would monitor further coalition activity for compliance violations, and Karen was advised, explicitly, to suspend any organized activity targeting Brian or his property. That evening, Brian returned home, sat on the steps of his porch with a glass of scotch, and watched the sunset roll through the pines. He didn't turn on the arcade. Not yet. For now, the quiet was enough. In the weeks that followed the hearing, something in the atmosphere of Bay Ridge Lane shifted. Not loudly, not immediately, but with the slow, inevitable certainty of a tide withdrawing after a long storm. The whispers quieted. The suspicious glances turned into nods, then eventually into the kind of wary neutrality that suburban neighbors offer when they realize they may have misjudged someone. Brian didn't expect apologies. He didn't want them. He only wanted the silence to mean what it used to, peace, not judgment. And gradually, it did. The flyers were gone. The coalition dissolved into a half-forgotten email thread and a Facebook page that hadn't been updated in weeks. Karen Jennings stopped appearing at community events, and her porch, once decorated with seasonal wreaths and potted plants, now stood bare. No one said what had happened aloud, but everyone knew, and that was enough. For Brian, victory didn't come with cheers or satisfaction. It came with maintenance. He reviewed his cameras less frequently but still checked them. He resumed his arcade nights, quietly, without fanfare, turning on only 2 or 3 machines at a time, savoring the blinking hum of vintage displays and the rhythmic click of buttons echoing in the concrete room. There were no more letters, no more visits, no more staring figures at the property line. Just the quiet joy of what he had built, unbothered. Occasionally, he would receive emails from colleagues at his former company, asking if he was ready to rejoin the industry, but he always replied politely with the same answer: not yet, because this, in all its silence and resistance and reclaimed control, had become more meaningful than any project he had built under a corporate banner. The lawsuit progressed slowly, as all civil cases do, but the message had already been delivered. Karen's attorney attempted a settlement, but Brian instructed Len to continue until the court rendered a decision. He wasn't interested in money. He was interested in precedent, that someone like Karen, regardless of her motivations, couldn't weaponize fear, suspicion, and soft bureaucracy to bully someone into silence. That a person's right to peace could not be outvoted by the insecure. That truth, when documented and defended without theatrics, still had power. And so they pushed forward, not for retribution, but to make the point matter. By late spring, the neighborhood felt different. Not better, just quieter. The type of quiet that comes after revelation, where people think twice before speaking, where the limits of intrusion have been made visible and real. Brian found himself walking the neighborhood more often, not to be seen, but to reclaim the act of belonging. Some people greeted him again, others still averted their eyes, but no one challenged him. He'd become part of the topography. Unchanged, unmoved, unbothered. Jeremy, the younger neighbor who had warned him early on, now dropped by occasionally with a 6-pack or a curiosity about the machines. Brian never offered full access. He wasn't interested in turning the arcade into a community novelty, but he did let Jeremy see the games once, walked him through their history, explained what made them special, not in a performative way, but with the care of someone who understood that meaning doesn't always need to be shared to be real. Karen, for her part, remained in the neighborhood, but mostly indoors. Her attempts to rally others had faded. Her lawn grew a little wilder, her mailbox lost its decorative signage, and her windows stayed closed, even on warm days. Brian didn't watch her. He didn't need to. Whatever war she thought she was fighting had already claimed its end. The city had placed a formal note on record regarding her actions, and while it didn't come with penalties, it stood as a barrier for any future campaigns. She had burned through her influence, not in flames, but in quiet withdrawal. No one said she lost, but no one followed her anymore either. On a Friday evening in early May, Brian opened the door to his basement, walked down the stairs, and turned on every machine. One by one, the screens flickered to life, sound blooming around him like an old, familiar storm. The arcade had always been more than nostalgia. It was a space of rhythm and memory, of stillness found in pattern. He played for an hour, then 2, then paused only when the power flickered slightly, just for a second, before returning. He smiled. It wasn't a glitch, just a reminder. Systems needed maintenance. So did lives, and so he kept the machines running, not every night, not loudly, but fully, not hidden, not explained, just as they were meant to be.